We're now going to look at using what we've already covered in techniques for optimizing decisions. You remember right at the beginning we said that asset management is about optimizing cost, risk and performance to give us the best combination of actions on our assets to deliver our organizational objectives. Thankfully, there are some techniques, well-developed techniques, that we can call on to help us do this. So, the one reason why we need to look at cost, risk and performance together is if you don't do that, if you look at cost and then you look at risk and then you look at performance, you can get caught in a very vicious circle. We see some very good examples of this, I guess PG&E and other kind of infrastructure organizations. So a very common way that this is shown is that maybe something happens, there's some kind of emergency, and everybody is now looking at risk. And while everybody's looking at risk, the chances are that we're not worrying so much about performance. And at some point, when the immediate danger is past, all the customers start complaining about performance. So now everybody rushes to improve performance, get the asset reliability up. And here it could be that we don't succeed and other things go downwards. But often for infrastructure, the real problem is your performance punished. Once you've put lots of effort into improving performance, customers get used to the fact that they have good performance. And once they're used to good performance, their attention passes to cost. They take it for granted that you can manage the assets well. They now start to ask about what it costs them. And then you get pushed into looking at cost. And if you're really unlucky, if once you start looking at reducing cost, you may cut something you shouldn't and you've increased the risk. We don't want to get caught in that vicious circle of focusing on one and then on the other, because our job as asset managers is to make sure that we're always looking at all three. Might make us a bit unpopular when everybody's worried about safety, we're talking about cost, and when everybody else is talking about cost, we're talking about safety. But our job is to understand how all of those come together. The total business impact, direct costs, benefits of performance, the cost of the organization if the assets fail, and optimizing all of these at every level to make sure that we can deliver our organizational objectives. So our job really is to be here always, to hold the center. Let's come back to remember the question we had about a bus engine. And to begin with, I gave you the example of two options for a new bus engine, one of which costs more upfront, but may save us a bit on maintenance, and the other one that's cheaper upfront, but no particular attitude towards things like maintenance or fuel efficiency. How we really want to put this question is a little bit different. First of all, instead of looking at upfront costs and hand-waving about future costs, we should actually work out what each of these asset options costs in total. And that is what it costs to buy, install, operate, maintain, dispose, refurbish, everything across the time we own that asset. So this question has changed from looking at the upfront costs to the total costs. In this case, option A has total costs across the life cycle of $1 million and is expected to last 10 years. Option B has total costs of $500,000 and is expected to last 4 years. Now, I should warn you, we don't actually have quite enough information yet to work out which is the best option, because the next question we have to ask is how long we actually want them for. Now, if I was to say that whatever this is, it's a bus engine, it's a transformer, we're going to need this something to do to move buses and something to do transforming well into the future, a lot longer than the 10 years. So we assume we need that function for well over 10 years. In that case, that we need whatever this is doing well into the future, which is the better option economically? Now, of course, I'm going to cheat a little bit. If you can think of anything that should be included, I've already included it. So considering absolutely everything about costs and risks now into the future, which is the better option if I'm going to need this function well into the future? And it turns out that this is quite easy to work out. The answer is the best option economically is that with the lowest average annual cost. Let's look back at that. In the first case, it's $1 million spread over 10 years, which gives us 100,000 per year on average. Option B is 500,000 over 4 years, and that gives us an average cost of 125,000 per year. So in this case, if I need whatever it is for longer than 10 years, option A is significantly cheaper overall. Now we have to average it because they have different lives. So we're really asking, what does that amount to per year? They could have different profiles, more upfront, less, etc. But how we work it out to compare two different options is to average them. And I'm hoping that everybody on this course is confident about how to do an average. I say this, of course, because long ago I did a survey of graduates, and I discovered that even English majors know how to do averages. They don't always know how to do fractions, but they're all right with averages. So this is quite simple. Divide the total cost by the number of years. It turns out that this is true whatever the options are. We just looked at two capital options, but actually the same thing is true if we're saying, should we go on maintaining this asset or should we replace it? You can see in that case that replacing it would cost more next year, but the really interesting question is what is it going to look like on average going forward? It might very well be that replacing it would be cheaper than keeping it going and replacing it later. So this is very straightforward. I have to say that some of the math involved in asset management isn't terribly challenging. So again, I want to suggest to you, this is just a better way of thinking about costs. What things cost on average is much more useful when we're thinking about costs. Now we all know that. I think we know that when we're buying household equipment, we really want to know what it's going to cost us overall, which is going to include how long it's going to last. So I buy a washing machine, and although I don't have all the data, I'm weighing up if I buy a slightly more expensive washing machine, is that likely to last longer? So I'm sort of trying to work out that figure. And there's another even better example that we all know about. We've all probably got caught out in the past, and that's inkjet printers, where this is a very good life cycle example where it's very cheap to buy the printer, and the real cost in having a printer at home is the cost of the ink. So quite a long time ago, people like Consumer Reports were putting out, don't look at the upfront cost, look at the overall costs. And in particular, for example, look at what it costs per page to print, averaging out the cost of the print up front and the cost of the ink. And the one which costs less per page is actually the better option for us. You'll see actually that's also true that if we aren't using it very often, the average will be different than if we're printing out lots of pages. So that's also something we have to take into account, just like how long do we actually need it. So we in fact all know this principle, that it's the lowest average annual cost, which is really the definition of cost. This is true for any asset decision. So if I've got two options, to maintain, to replace, to refurbish or to replace, should I put in two assets or just one? I can still use this basic equation to work out which is the better overall option. And remember that costs include risks. So it's already built in whether it works or not. Okay, so far so simple. How do we do this in practice? Well, I want to look at, I mentioned that I want in particular to look at a choice that we don't always think of being determined by costs, or at least not in this way. I want to ask the question, what do we mean by asset life? And in particular, what's the optimum life? We use all sorts of phrases around life, like design life, which is usually a conservative engineering assessment of the minimum that this asset will a number of years this asset will work. We could use useful life or expected life, which are more like how long do we expect this to run before we want to replace it. But best of all is the idea of optimum life. How long should we keep the asset? Remember, not how long could we, but how long should we keep it? And this is defined fairly straightforwardly. It's basically about the lowest life cycle costs, that average figure. Whichever option gives us the lowest average annual cost is going to be the best economic option. Let's have a look at this in practice. This is a classic asset management curve which talks about when should we replace an asset. In other words, how long should we keep an asset before we replace it? And this is a really important curve because it suggests that there is a good time to replace an asset, and if you keep it longer than that, it's actually going to cost you more. So this is how it works. The first thing is to assume this asset costs, say, 100,000 to actually build. If I, for some strange reason, replace that asset the first year, you'll notice along the bottom it says the year that we replace it. So I buy it and I replace it in the same year. I get the full hit of that 100,000 in that year. However, if I keep it for 10 years, I spread that capital cost over 10 years. And that means that the capital cost essentially is just a tenth. I mean, this is why we don't replace assets in the first year, of course, and we try to keep them as long as possible. In fact, if all we cared about, take that out of the way for a moment, if all we cared about is the capital cost, we'd keep our assets forever. Okay, this is determined to keep my hands off. Because if all we cared about the capital cost is the longer we keep it, the more we can spread it over the number of years. And this is why I think we get caught in the idea of trying to keep our assets longer, of extending their life. But the problem is that isn't the only set of costs. And the other set of costs get worse the longer we keep them. That is, the longer we keep the asset, the more it costs to run it. And that's because as it starts to wear out, it starts to fail, the costs of reactive maintenance go up, we might have to do more planned maintenance, and of course we've got the knock-on impact on our customers. So this is an example of something called a cost-risk optimization, where it's not cost versus risk, it's basically putting all the costs and risks together and asking where they are a minimum. The right time to replace this asset, whatever it is not in fact where they cross, which is just an artificial. What we do is we add these two together, the capital cost and the increasing cost of running it, we add them together and we get this line, this yellow line, which is almost always, it's a shallow U. And the principle here is where the minimum point on that curve is going to give us the right time to replace, because that's the point at which our average annual costs are lowest. What's important about this curve is that it shows, well, in the first instance, it doesn't really much matter whether we replace it in year 3 or year 5, because that's not going to make a lot of difference to our average annual costs. But if we keep it beyond then, there comes a point where if I keep it 8 years, my average annual costs over the life of that asset are now twice as much. In other words, it's 100% more expensive than if I'd replaced it in year 4. This is a very important concept to work through with people like finance about why keeping assets too long could be actually more expensive than getting rid of them. This is a cost-risk optimization. In this case, it says that somewhere between year 3 and 4, we should replace it. It's a good thing that it's a fairly flat curve, because nobody wants somebody coming along and saying, I have to replace this asset on July 13th, 2034. We've got real capital programs to manage, so it's a good thing that we've got some leeway when we actually replace it, when we prioritize it and rank it against other assets which are also needing replacement. So that's cost-risk optimization. And the important thing here is that keeping assets too long can be as expensive as replacing them too soon. What we really want is just right, the Goldilocks principle. Okay, so that's cost-risk optimization. And in fact, to work it out is not that complicated. I'm not going to do it now, but when we do the full 5-day course, called the certificate course, we actually work this out, and it's not difficult at all to work out if you've got a good idea about what all the costs are in your assets. So I want to now move to another example of optimizing, because we can use the same principle for other decisions. And here I'm going to move us to Microsoft, a virtual whiteboard, and I want to look at the question of optimizing spares. I think this is perhaps even the simplest example of cost-risk optimization. So before I start, however, I want to ask, who is it that loves spares? Who likes to have as many spares as possible? And the answer is operations and maintenance. And they like having spares because if something breaks, they have a spare, they can fix it and get it back into operation as quickly as possible. And operations and maintenance are motivated by keeping their assets running or getting them back into service as soon as possible. That's our reason, our purpose in being maintenance. So we like spares. Who, on the other hand, doesn't like spares, especially those big, expensive spares that we might never use, we have for emergencies? And the answer here is finance. So why do finance hate spares? If you've never come across, I'm not really exaggerating, they're not very fond of spares. And the reason they don't like spares, especially the big expensive spares that we never use, that by the time we might want to use them, they're out of date or they're worn out, I mean, they've passed their sell-by date, is to finance that looks like a waste of money. It's tying up money that could be used elsewhere. I mean, maybe they don't like spending money anyway, but they particularly don't like spending on spares that are never going to be used. So their motivation is to not waste money. So you can see that both operations and maintenance and finance both have something on their side. They're actually trying to do the best for the organisation. But we have to have a way to decide in a much more rational way how many spares we should have. And it's another cost-risk optimization. So let's have a look at it. And this is the perils of working from home. my cat is deciding to have a little bit of a shout on me. So apologies if you hear. My Siamese cat is having a good old caterwaul. All right, so let's break up the problem. First of all, there's the cost of holding the spare. The cost to hold, obviously to have no spares doesn't cost you anything, but more or less it's then a straight line. The more spares you hold, the more it's going to cost you. So we can say that as we hold more spares, the cost to hold them. Now, the cost to hold them is not actually the same as the cost to buy them. It's more than that. There's also the cost of the inventory, the warehouse, and in fact, the capital that's tied up in the spares that we could use elsewhere. So it's more expensive than the cost simply to buy it. So you can see why finance don't like, they'd rather have zero spares. If it was up to them, they'd have zero. Maintenance and operations, on the other hand, are looking at something else, which is something that's going in the opposite direction, which is what happens if we don't have the spare. If we have no spares at all, we can't afford for anything to go wrong. If we have one spare, we can at least now have one asset fail and we can fix it. This is not a straight line because obviously the risk is highest if we've got no spares, but it quite quickly starts to tend down. Sorry about my virtual whiteboarding skills, drawing skills. That should be a nice smooth curve because it's about to do with probabilities. If I have one spare, I can afford one asset to fail. If I have two spares, I can afford two. But the probability of having two assets fail at the same time is essentially half that of one of them failing. So it comes down in a slightly wonky line. It actually reduces. Never gets to zero, by the way, because as long as I've got lots of assets, there's always a theoretical possibility they could all fail together. They're all zapped by lightning together or something like that. It never gets to be zero, but it starts to get to be very small. Okay, so finance would rather have zero and maintenance and operations would rather have a lot. How do we decide what the right answer is? Well, in this particular example, I've actually added my risks if I don't have the asset. I've added to the costs of having the spare. So I put them all together and I've added the total line is then this line here. Okay. Where is that at a minimum? Well, the answer is taking account of my drawing. It looks as if the right answer is that I should have about, I can't actually see the answer from where I'm looking. The answer looks like I should have 5 spares. Okay, you get the idea. There's the direct cost to hold the spares. There's the risks if I don't have the spares. What are the risks? If I don't have the spare, then my system, I have an unavailable asset that might, of course, cause an outage. And how I work this curve out is the probability of the assets failing in the first place, the consequences if I don't have the asset up and running on number of customers hit by an outage. And the third factor, of course, is lead time, because if I could go pop down the corner store and buy the spare, I wouldn't need to hold it. But if it's going to take 7 months to order, especially from Germany, I'm very likely to want to hold a spare, because otherwise, whatever it is going to be out for 7 months. Okay, so the answer is that I should hold 5 spares. So this is cost risk optimization applied to spares, the same idea. My total costs and my total risks, when are they lowest? So if we go back now to let's have a slightly better drawn example where you'll see my blue is the cost to hold it, the red is the risk if I don't have the spare when I need it, and in this case the answer is 5. So we can use the same principle of cost risk optimization for optimizing spares. And you note that this is kind of an example of dynamic tension. Finance don't want spares, maintenance and operations do. We have to have a logical and data-driven, rational way to decide how many spares we should hold. I have to say, I don't know what your reaction is, that quite often when I'm teaching maintenance and operations, they're a bit unhappy about the answer being 4, because the risk that I won't have a spare when I need it is not 0. If I have 5 assets fail simultaneously, I'm going to be short 1 spare. So it's just that the risk of not having the spare is now outweighed by the cost of holding it. I hope that makes sense. And we can use this on other things. For example, on access. The same idea that when I take an asset out or a whole line out in a clearance so that I can do work on it, there's a cost obviously of that, which is that I've got this system is unavailable. But the longer the outage, the more work I can do. And I don't just mean in a bit more work. All the costs of the clearance and getting all the equipment and people in and then getting them out again and then re-energizing. I'm spreading over more work the longer the outage. So this is again another dynamic balance between how long the outage is, because the longer it is, the more likely it is to impact on customers, against the amount of work I can do in that outage. And the same thing we'll come to in a minute is true of maintenance and even resources. If I have no technical specialists free on the day I need them, that's going to impact on my projects, or I can't fix an asset. If I have lots and lots of people just sitting, you get the idea. These are all cost risk optimization. And optimization is really the name of the game in asset management. And what it feels like to be doing good asset management is that you're optimizing at all levels. You're optimizing for individual assets, for example, their planned maintenance, right up to optimizing the overall business plan. There are layers of optimization that have to interact. This is why it actually is quite complicated to coordinate. It's easier if you're just running an individual asset, but when you're putting it into the context of other assets, you have to optimize at different levels. I'll give you an example of this in a minute. I want to move on to a little bit more detail about how we do maintenance optimization, which is a very well understood set of techniques that's been around for quite a while. Sometimes this is known by the name of RCM, reliability-centered maintenance. It's basically a risk-based approach, a reliability approach to maintenance. And I want to just talk you through it, not just because it's very important for maintenance, but because the same thinking that comes out of maintenance, we can actually apply to other things. So let's have a look at this. So I have an asset, and that asset sits within a system, and the asset has components. It also has something else that's very important, which you might have picked up when I talked about bicycle risk assessment, which is that the asset has a function, and it can fail to fulfill a function, even if it's not broken, for example, if it's stolen. So we have to look at not only where the asset sits and what's part of it, but also what's its function, what is it we want it to do, and how could it fail to deliver that function. So this is we analyse what we've got and we start to then think about this particular asset. We ask, what are the different ways in which it can fail, which here is called failure modes, and then our old friend consequences. If it fails, what are the potential consequences? You can, I hope, see that this is a risk assessment, slightly more complicated, and it takes quite a long time to do thoroughly. If you remember the bow tie, because there are lots of different ways it can fail and lots of different potential consequences. Okay, once we've worked out how it can fail and what the consequences could be and the probabilities, we then say, what can we do about it? What kind of risk treatment or risk mitigations? And when we've decided what we can do to manage this risk, we might then also ask how often we're going to do them, especially for planned maintenance. This is the basic principle of RCM, or risk-based maintenance. They have some older-fashioned terms which I grew up on, which you might have come across already, you still hear around. This is the world of failure modes and effects analysis, or failure modes, effects, and criticality analysis. Criticality is if it fails, how bad are its consequences compared to other things. And just in case you're wondering, on the next slide, there is in fact a sheet of acronyms to explain. So don't have to worry for the moment what these stand for. Failure modes and effects analysis, usually called FMEA or FMECA. And within FMEA or FMECA, we can talk about FTA. Think back to our bow tie, where we've got those branching, all the different possible routes towards failure, different root causes in different paths. It is in fact a tree, and this hence fault tree analysis, the different ways it can fail, the different paths to failure. And the matching tree on the other side is called here event tree analysis, the potential consequences branching out. So we've analysed failure in some detail, and then we've got mitigations. We're going to talk a little bit about this rule-based task allocation. Once we know how it fails, in fact, one reason why we want to know how it fails is it's going to give us a very good clue as to what might be a good option for managing it. Not necessarily preventing it failing, but managing the risk overall. And once we've decided what tasks to do, we might need to work out how many to do. And this is our old friend cost risk optimization, to work out how often, for example, should we inspect an asset. And this is the world of RCM, risk or risk-based maintenance. RCM is very formal and takes quite a lot of work and is best applied to assets which are very critical. That is, you're really in trouble if they fail. And also, it's usually more useful for things like mechanical assets. Whereas risk-based maintenance, which is perhaps a bit looser use of the same ideas, you could do it in an afternoon with 3 of you sitting around a table, is incredibly useful for all assets. So this is the world of maintenance optimization, and here are, if you ever need to, are the acronyms: failure modes and effects analysis, failure modes, effects and criticality analysis, fault tree analysis, event tree analysis, and RCM, reliability centered maintenance. Now, having gone through that, like risk assessment, it's actually easier to do it in practice than to talk about it for very long. So I'm going to ask you to consider for a minute how we actually do this. We're going to go back to our old friend, a bicycle. And this time, I want you to look at failure modes, which is failure due to, for root cause analysis, failure due to a particular cause. For example, chain seizes due to wear. So if we were doing this face-to-face, you'd work in your groups, you'd pick up one of your risks like flat tire, and you'd think about at least 5 or 6 different ways you might end up with a flat tire. Believe me, there are many different ways to end up with a flat tire. And then we're going to look at, there are different ways that we could get a flat tire, for example, and we're going to ask, can we see any pattern in it? Can we see any categorization that would be useful? So what I want to do again is go back to my wonderful Microsoft whiteboard, and I'm going to show you what this means in practice. So I'll just minimize that a bit. So the idea here is take a flat tire. What are some possible ways we could end up with a flat tire? Perhaps the one that comes most easily to mind about why we might get a flat tire, the cause of a flat tire, is we've got a hole in the inner tube. We have a hole in the inner tube, it can't hold air, and the tire is going to flatten. But it isn't in fact the only way to have a flat tire. Another possible way to have a flat tire is we've got a faulty valve. And the faulty valve might be faulty either because it's always been faulty or because we haven't maintained it very well and it's got clogged up. Actually, other ways we could have a flat tire. We could have a flat tire because we never pumped it up enough in the first place. We could have underinflated it. Or we could have overinflated it and ended up with a hole in the inner tube. Now, when we say hole in an inner tube, we haven't quite gone far enough because we want to know why have we got a hole in the inner tube. Because depending on why we've got a hole in the inner tube is going to affect what's a good option for managing that risk. And here's a principle called the 5 whys. The 5 whys is essentially you go, I've got a flat tire. Why? I've got a hole in the inner tube. But that doesn't give us enough information to know how to manage it. We have to fix it, yes, but how are we going to manage it going forward? Well, we then say, how could I have a hole in the inner tube? And there are lots of different ways I could get a hole in the inner tube. I could have run over a sharp object in the road. It could be worn out. The inner tube is perished. It could be vandalism. And again, flat tire, why? I've got a hole in the inner tube. Why? Because of vandalism. The problem here is we still don't have enough information because there are other matters. How? Why did it get vandalized? I was going to say, who vandalized it? So imagine that I parked my bike in a dodgy part of town and my tires have been vandalized. What would be my strategy for managing that risk going forward? The chances are would be don't park my bike there. However, that's assuming it was random. What if it wasn't random? What if it was deliberate? Somebody was targeting my bike. Then we have to ask, why? Well, we haven't finished yet because there's 2 possibilities. Somebody's targeted our tires. One is that they are a psychopath. Let's assume it's our neighbour. I live next to somebody who just likes to vandalise other people's tires. What's your risk management strategy going to be if you've got a neighbour who likes to slash your tires for no good reason? You're starting to move into the world of buy another house. But what if in fact it's not that your neighbour likes to slash your tires for no good reason? They vandalised it because you ran over their cat yesterday and didn't apologise. Okay, I'm not going to take this much further, but you can see that I'm going to have to ask why. Why did my neighbour vandalise my tyre? If they're a psychopath, I might have to move. If it's because I did something to them, maybe I need another strategy, which is to go and apologise to them. Okay, so this is the 5 whys. In my world, most of the time you don't have to go 5 times. For example, if the answer was I have a flat tyre because I underinflated, I now know what my management strategy going forward is, which is keep your tyres inflated, and that might then be inspect your tyres to see whether you have inflated them properly. I can get to a good option pretty quickly. Sometimes it takes a bit more work, and my rule of thumb is don't go too far. I once in a class challenged people to see how many times they could go why before we got to unhappy childhood. So flat tyre because of hole in inner tube, because of vandalism, because my neighbour is a psychopath, and you see what I mean. I could end up with because they had an unhappy childhood. And my rule of thumb, the law school rule of thumb, is when you get to unhappy childhood, you've gone too far. You can't do much about it. What we're looking for is things we can do something about. So underinflated tyre, check that my tyre has enough air in it before I set off on a journey. We've already talked about what to do about sharp object in road. Sometimes people think, oh, well, maybe I'll go on a different road. That may not be an option. And we know that sharp objects on roads are reasonably random. I mean, some roads may just be much more rugged than others. But usually, rather than taking a different route, we take the more all-purpose strategy of having a puncture repair kit or a spare in a tube, which means that we can't do much about the sharp object in road, but if we run over one, we get a puncture, we can repair it very quickly. So, okay, so the idea here, root cause analysis. Now these are potential causes. Obviously, if you actually had a flat tire, you might want to ask, why did I get a flat tire this time? But we're not looking at that problem at the moment. We're looking at what can I do to manage the risk of a flat tire? And sometimes it's doing something after I get the flat tire. Sometimes it might be before. So that is root cause analysis, failure modes. So let's have a look at about how we now use those failure modes, because remember, we're looking at why things fail to look at what we can do about it. In asset management, it's always about what we can do about it. Okay, so I've now looked at some failure modes, and now I want to use that to decide what I'm going to do about it. And this, we've done our failure modes and effects analysis. We're moving now into rule-based task allocation. And in the world of RCM, reliability-centered maintenance, on the whole, we identify 4 categories of ways things can fail. And you may not have come across these terms, but you may be familiar with them by a different name. So the first 2 are PF failure modes and usage-related failure modes. PF failure mode is very straightforward. It's basically where there's an asset is deteriorating over time, but that I can first pick up through inspection or condition that my asset is starting to look a little wonky. But there's a gap between picking up this first sign of condition deterioration before it's very likely that it fails. There's a gap, which is called the PF. I didn't invent any of these names, but between potential failure and failure, there's time for me to do something. That could be 3 minutes or 3 years. But basically, I'm picking up a sign here through an inspection or condition assessment. It tells me my asset is starting to go south towards more likely failure, and I can do something about it, like, for example, replace it. That's very useful. This is going to allow me, if I can pick it up here, I can do something before it actually fails. Even better than that is usage-related failure modes, and this comes back to our old friend, the deterioration model. Now, I'm looking at bathtub curves in particular because they're particularly useful. You notice that in a bathtub curve, you've got 3 different steps. The beginning, when the asset's not really settled down, or we don't know how to operate it, or hasn't quite been finished. It then settles down until there comes a point where it starts turning to be more likely to fail. It's not that difficult to prove mathematically that if you have a bathtub curve, the right time to replace it is just before it starts to turn the curve. Because remember, once it starts to fail, you're going to have all those knock-on impacts, not just reactive maintenance costs, but impacts on customers. So the right time to replace a component is just before it starts to deteriorate markedly. All right, so that's PF failure mode and usage-related failure mode. And we like those because there's something we can do about it. We like this one even better than this one. In this case, I don't even have to do an inspection. I can predict that this is the right time to replace. Good examples of this is if you take your car into the shop for a regular service, most of the failure modes they're looking at are PF failure modes. In other words, they're inspecting, they're checking to see how inflated the tires are, and they're looking at the bodywork and they're checking the brakes, that kind of thing. But there are a couple of things we do with car services which we don't do an inspection. We do what in Australia we call hard time. Now that means something different in American. Hard time meaning we don't even inspect, we just replace every 6 months. And 2 examples of these hard time usage-related failure mode tasks are replacing the oil and timing belts. Now, the timing belt is basically that after a certain number of miles, we just replace it because it's quite difficult to tell if it's worn, and it's quite problematic if it fails. The engine don't work. So on the whole, we've got millions of data points from lots of different cars around the world. We've worked out that the right time to replace the timing belt is here, and then our service manuals say just replace it after so many miles or so many years. Replacing the oil is actually, for a power person, indicates something quite interesting. We could analyse the oil, we could inspect it, and only replace the oil if it looks pretty yucky. However, we don't for an economic reason, because we could analyse the oil, but doing the oil analysis would be more expensive than replacing the oil completely. We don't analyse it, we just replace it. We take it as a hard time task. So in the world of planned maintenance, we have a combination of these condition-based tasks and inspections and what's called proactive or preventative tasks, replacing something before it's likely to fail. So we like those. Those are both very proactive ways to manage our assets. The one that we have problems with is the, actually I'll take you to the next one. This one is the most problematic one. Hidden failure modes are things like electronics or light bulbs or alarms where we don't really have any warning that they're going to fail, and the best we can do is check if they've already failed. In other words, before you take off in your plane, you check whether all your instruments are working, and if not, you replace them. You don't expect them to fail in flight, but we do it by checking that things are still working. We can't predict it and we don't get any warning. At least we can know that they're working when we set off. The one that's most problematic for RCM type people is the failures that maintenance can't help us with. And these are all much more painful to manage. First is that you've got a design or manufacturing defect. If there's something wrong with the asset, there's nothing you can do with maintenance. You're going to have to replace it. And this can be quite painful because if you've got one component that's failed once, you have to ask yourself whether the same component in other assets is also got the same defect or is likely to have the same defect. Should you replace all of them? That's quite a difficult decision. And then you have to decide whether you're ever going to buy this component again or whether you're ever going to work with that manufacturer again. This one's quite complicated. Another one which is very complicated and of course hits power is third-party damage. That could be vandalism, it could be other utilities digging into our assets in the road, it could be animals. I mean, one of my favourite stories about animals is I was shown at PG&E a picture of on a pole top transformer where they had what they called animal abatement, where they put a shield round the asset to stop the squirrels getting at it, because obviously a squirrel getting an asset can short. That doesn't do the squirrel any good, by the way, but it's not good for the asset either. And they had a great example, a photograph of a shield, an animal abatement shield around a transformer, where the squirrels were using the shield to collect acorns, unintended consequences, and it shorted the entire system. So animals, New York Power Authority hates beavers because their most common cause of failure of a pole in the less inhabited areas in upper New York State is actually beavers eating the poles. So there are a lot of beavers. Of course, we know that another really common third-party damage, which is true for poles, is man v pole. I didn't really believe this the first time I was told it. I was in Amman with state electricity there, and they told me that the most common cause of pole failure, wooden pole failure, were people driving into the poles. And I thought, well, that's maybe because they have quite good roads in Amman and they drive quite fast cars. Maybe they're not very good drivers, until I found the same thing's true in Montana. Maybe it's also true of Montana, but basically people driving into poles is a very common failure mode for wooden poles. And this is a bit strange, a bit like the squirrels who fry themselves. It doesn't usually do anybody any good to hit a pole. Some people believe there's a kind of mysterious magnetic attraction when you're a drunk driver to hit the pole when you come off the road. All of these are difficult to manage. We've got all sorts of strategies to try to avoid third-party damage, for example, with other utilities, dial before you dig equivalent, where all utilities sharing their GIS maps so they know where each other's assets are. Another problem is operator error or misuse. Although that's we could try to design that out so it's difficult to misuse an asset, but this is really a failure mode where it begs the answer training. Make sure the operators know how to operate the asset. And then my absolute favorite failure mode is called maintenance-induced failure. It was something we actually did to the asset that caused it to fail. And this is a serious problem for any kind of asset that requires us to go and touch the asset. Anything we have to adjust or calibrate, there's a finite possibility that we'll adjust or calibrate it in the wrong direction. And another example here is my underinflation or overinflating my tires, giving me a problem with my tires. They were my fault. And here, of course, this is, again, going to be around training and making it clear how to do the task and making sure everybody's trained to do it properly. So those are all more difficult, and they're the sort of unrespectable end. You'll notice that they are not about how to stop something failing in the first place. Often third-party damage or design and manufacturing defect might very well be what can we do to minimize the going forward by a completely different approach to how we manage our assets. Okay, so that's rule-based task allocation. Now, at the end of this process, we now decided what we're going to do about it. We're going to do an inspection. We're going to replace a component. We're going to have more training. We've decided the task to manage this risk going forward. And sometimes we have to then decide how much to do with it. So I've got my different failure modes. I've done rule-based task allocation. So condition-based tasks for a PF failure mode, etc. But the next thing I have to do is how much should I do of each of these? And this is back to our old friend, the cost risk optimization. This time, what's going on is the weekly costs, the average weekly costs, and how often we're going to do the task. It's the same principle. The more often I do a task, the more it's going to cost me. If I do something once a week, like an inspection, it's going to roughly cost me 10 times as much as if I only did it once every 10 weeks. So the cost of doing the maintenance goes down the less often I do it. The problem, of course, as we all know, is the bigger the gap between inspections, the more likely the asset's going to fail between inspections, because the risk is going up and the cost of failure or downtime is going up the longer I leave it. So this is another cost risk optimization, another trade-off with the same sort of idea. I add everything together and that gives me my total impact, balancing cost and risk. And this, what you'll see, gives me the answer. Whatever this task is, I should probably do it about once every 3.5 weeks. So I've done my mathematical optimization and worked out that we should do this inspection about once every 3.5 weeks. At which point, I hope some of you are jumping up and down, because that's the wrong answer, isn't it? Nobody does inspections every 3.5 weeks, because this might be the optimal answer for this individual task on this individual asset. But we've got maintenance crew to manage and to work out bundles of jobs, or if somebody goes out with the truck, what are all the tasks they're going to do that day? We just don't do tasks every 3.5 days. This is definitely where decimal places doesn't help you. I'm not going to go out in the truck to do this task for 3.5 weeks and then go out the next day to do one that's 3 weeks and 5 days. We tend to bundle them as every day, week, month, quarter, 6 month into bundles so that we can go out and do a group of them to that cost of the travel we're spreading across different tasks. Now the curve, the shape of this yellow curve itself tells you the right answer, which is that we can't do it every 3.5 weeks. We have a choice either say to do it every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks. And the shape of the curve makes it very clear that the right answer is every 4 weeks. Because look what happens if I do it every 2 weeks. Sure, my risk is less, but that's outweighed by the increase in cost of doing the work. So the right answer, put it in context, those layers of optimization, is to do it every 4 weeks. Okay, optimization. Now I'm going to move on to what underpins all of this, which is having the right information. Now, this is quite a big subject, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but some basic principles of asset information. Basically, remember our plan, do, check, act loop. We need to be looking at what happens to our assets. We have a good plan, as we talked about. We then go out and deliver it with our good people on the ground. We then have to check what actually happened. What was its performance? What did it cost? What happened how many safety incidents were there? And if we don't like the answer, we have to go around again. So this is actually a principle in asset information, knowing what to look for when we, in our plan, do, check, act loop. One problem when we're thinking about asset performance for asset management is that we're not only interested in today's performance. In fact, I go so far to say for an asset manager involved in making decisions for the future, today's performance is just a data point. The people who have to worry about taking the assets as we've got them and making the best of them today is really the world of operations. But for an asset manager looking at decisions, maintenance schedules or replacement planning, it's not really the performance today that we're interested in. We're interested in the performance in the future. We're building for the future. So a good asset manager is always asking, not is it working today, but I don't care what happens tomorrow, but is it performing today and it's going to go on performing. Remember the principle of sustainable and unsustainable. We want to make sure that our assets not only perform today, but they're going to go on performing into the future. Our job is to look for asset performance sustainably and economically. The problem is that most of the time our organizations focus only on today's performance, or literally actually yesterday's performance. Somebody once said looking at yesterday's performance to determine what you should do tomorrow is like driving through through looking in the rearview mirror. So our job is to make sure that if the assets are working now, they're still working in 10 years. If they're not working today, then our job is to make sure that they will be working in 10 years' time. So this is a problem about the future, which is that we as asset managers are always looking for the future. But quite often we only look at what's happening today. This is why I want to also stress that this is why having good history can help us, because if we know how this asset has performed for the last 10 years, we have a chance of predicting how it's going to behave in future. Okay, so why do we tend to look at this, what we could call an output? The output of a long string of things is the asset worked or it didn't work today. It's an output. Why are we so focused on outputs when we also need to make sure that our asset's going to work in 20 years' time? The problem here is that lots of people around us are quite short term. Outputs, did the asset work? Yes, no. What did it cost us? Did we have a safety incident? They're fairly easy to know because they've already happened. But actually there are other reasons why we look at outputs. Customers, I'm afraid, tend to be fairly short term. They tend to be thinking about whether the asset is working today, or actually they're not even thinking about the asset, are they? They're thinking, do I have electricity right at this minute? And you probably had the experience of trying to persuade customers that it's for their own good, that we've got a planned outage, so we're putting in something that's going to make the system more reliable. Don't really care. I think of this, I fly quite a lot in normal circumstances, and I think of this as when you go to an airport, and you're thinking about going to Starbucks or pizza or something like that. And when you get to where you expect the coffee shop to be, there's a big hoarding which will always have a poster saying, "We're building you a better experience. Please be patient." And you know what? You don't care. You just wanted your coffee. Efficiency targets tend, in other words, short-term cost savings normally aren't looking at the impact longer term. So anything around efficiency tends, unfortunately, look at short-term cost savings rather than long-term cost savings. Senior managers are usually measured on today's performance and may not stick around all that long. And of course, politicians famously are only really looking at what happens to the next election. The worst offenders of all, thankfully, we don't have to suffer from too much in Tacoma Power, are stock markets, which can be amazingly short-term. They react very reactively to what's happening today. If you look at what's happened with the COVID-19 pandemic and watch what happened to the markets, it all seems a bit hysterical. And the real problem for us as asset managers who are trying to plan for the future is who is actually thinking about what's this asset going to be doing in 10 years' time. So information, we're going to talk about what kind of information is most important in a minute. But I want to introduce a really important principle here, which is information in our organizations only has any value if it helps us make better decisions. Just having information and looking at it and thinking, oh, that's nice, isn't actually worth it unless we do something about it. I don't want to sound too puritanical, but basically this is all about what we're going to do about it. When we get the information, does it mean we should do something differently? Does it mean we should keep doing what we're doing? Information only has value if it impacts, it allows us to make better decisions. And for us as asset people, those are decisions about, does it help us make better decisions about prioritizing replacements? Does it support us and make better maintenance schedules? The information all has to be focused on what is it, the decision we're making and how we're making it. This is not as complicated as it sounds. If, for example, we decide to replace assets on age, that's not terrible. It's not brilliant. It's not best practice, but for some assets, we might decide just to replace on age. It's 10 years. We don't exactly know what condition it's in, but we're going to replace it every 10 years. If that were how you prioritize what to replace when, the single most important piece of information, I said this wasn't complicated, the single most important piece of information we would then need to know about whether to replace this asset was its install date. Now, I've worked with power companies where they don't have install date for all their assets, so they can't even use age as a way to decide what to replace first. So if you tell me that you make decisions on age, it means the most important information is the install date, in other words, how long we've had it. So the first thing with information, don't start by what data can I collect or what IT systems can we put in. Ask what decisions we make and how we make them. Because once you've done that, it becomes very obvious what's the most important information. Age-based decisions require us to understand age. So we then can say, what information do we need to help us make these decisions? How do we get the information? Who's responsible for providing it? And last but not least, what does this information cost us to collect against the benefit in better decisions? We don't often think about this. Asset information is actually quite expensive to collect and store and put in IT. We don't often ask whether it's actually giving us any benefit in better decisions. Better decisions, for example, that lead to happier customers or even reduce costs. So when we think of information, always start at the top with what decision and how do we want to make that decision. Remember, we make decisions all the way through the organization and at all these levels. And that's the basic principle of asset information, is how we're making decisions and what information is going to make those decisions better. Quite often, there are bits of information that won't actually change the answer. If we're replacing on age, it doesn't really matter what color it is, because that's not going to affect the decision, and therefore the color might not be that interesting. That you get that. Okay, so if that's the basic principle of asset information, we already said, what is it that we are trying to make decisions on? What is it, when we say we're optimizing, what are we optimizing? We're optimizing cost, risk, and performance to come up with the best optimal combination of all the actions on assets to deliver our organizational goals. And if we've got to optimize cost, risk, and performance, means that first and foremost, we've got to understand what things cost, not just upfront, but through their life cycles. Risk, which partly this is underpinned by having good failure history. If we know how often things have failed in the past, we can predict how much they're going to fail in future. Absolutely essential for understanding risk, if we can understand how things have failed in the past. Failure history data. And then, of course, also performance, what the asset is actually doing for us. I would include with this also, and why, what underpins good performance of our assets. So these are the three main categories of information we need to pull together to make good decisions. That wasn't too painful. Well, some of these may be a little bit painful to collect, but basically anything that we've got is going to help us make better decisions. So just have a quick look at what kind of information we're talking about, so you can see failure and cost. But actually, there are all kinds of things we need to make good decisions. We need to know about, for example, what the law is. We need to know what our goals are. There's all kinds of things that we need. An awful lot of them aren't really, strictly speaking, data. These ones on the left-hand side are very often fairly sensibly collected and stored data in databases, like what is our list of assets and what type of asset, capacity, install date, where it is. All of these is basic data about all our assets and how we use them, how often they fail, what they cost, inspections. All of these things can be data. But at the other end, we've got photographs, we've got customer complaints that might come by email or by phone. We've got diagrams, we've got permits. All of these are not really data, and yet we need to know them in order to make good decisions. This is the world of structured data we can keep in the database quite simply, and then unstructured. We might want them to be a bit more structured, but basically we're always going to be dependent on some unstructured data. And even more than that, we're going to be dependent on people's experience that we haven't yet found a way to capture in a computer. Not in my working life, not likely in your working life either. So that's the kind of information that we need to know, not all of it data. And here's the kind of, I'm not going to go in huge detail, but the kind of IT that we might require. I'll just take you through this one because this is a very central IT system in asset management, which combines something called an asset registry or asset inventory, which is basically a list of all our assets and their basic attributes, what type, what manufacturer, what condition they're in, their capacity, when they were installed, where they are. This is all basic asset registry or asset inventory data. And believe me, if you don't know what assets you've got, it's quite difficult to do good asset management. The second one is the world of work management, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, which is really about planned maintenance, having schedules of proactive maintenance that then inform when and what we do on our assets on the ground. And then failure history, which I love, as you probably gathered already, which is when people have gone out to do the maintenance, for example, when on something that's broken, they then also report back, why did it fail and what do we do about it? So we understand its failure and what we did about it. Now, normally all three of these come together now in something called an enterprise asset management system, which in your case is SAP. But there are all sorts of other systems. Obviously, inventory and procurement need IT systems. We increasingly use project management for capital systems, capital projects, which keep the details of program and projects. Geographical information systems, absolutely invaluable for distribution with a lot of distributed assets, is essentially a mapping system which captures all assets where they are and where they are in relationship to each other, and perhaps design systems. And then a few more systems. On the whole, risk is not well covered by IT yet, but we're starting to see that come through. The best run system in your organization will be finance. There's a good IT joke, which is, what is the most accurate database in your organization? And the answer, of course, is payroll, because if there's something wrong in the payroll system, you have hundreds of people who are going to tell finance very, very quickly. So we also have operational systems, remote condition monitoring, which is increasingly starting to be used on transmission, telemetry and SCADA. These are operational systems that know about what our assets are doing at a distance. Very, very useful. They're essentially real time. They're catching what's happening in real time. And we can get data out of them, not just the fact that something's in alarm. Slightly less impressive systems, document management systems. I have nothing really against document management systems, except that they're trying to document the way people think, which is much more complicated than remote condition monitoring. I think that you use SharePoint. Increasingly, that's because that's essentially free, and it's only as good as it's designed, although we could say that's the same is true for all IT. Decision support tools. Now, we talked about whole life cost models that allow us to then look at different options, but in fact we use models. I don't know how many systems you use, but But a good example of a system, a decision support model that's very complex, is what your colleagues in Tacoma Water use. Nobody now runs water systems without having what's called hydraulic models, mostly because it's extremely difficult to work out what's happening with water flow in a network, in a distribution network, if you don't model the hydraulics, with the math of which is fearsomely complicated. But these days, we wouldn't cut in a new connection to a new customer on a water system without running it in a complex hydraulic model. I think this is the shape of things to come. We'll have more modeling support for what we do. I think we do use system models routinely in electricity as well. And then there are other things for actually reporting. We're not going to go into this in detail, but in our organizations, there's a lot of management reporting. We have a problem, it's reported upwards. We have monthly reports that say how much things are costing. This is a big business in any organization, is regular reporting. And then to put together with our IT systems and our kinds of data, we have to ask about processes. Data doesn't collect itself, she says, and you have somewhere to put it, but you also have to have a process of actually getting the information into the IT and out of it again. And the key processes for asset information are, surprise, surprise, the key processes in asset management. That is maintenance, capital projects, operations. These three main processes in managing our assets are also where we get the most fundamental information. We'll talk a little bit more about the information we get back from maintenance. The one thing we must get from capital projects is the as-built, and I've talked about that a bit. And we routinely depend on operations to tell us how the assets actually operated today. There could be other things like customer complaints. In some industries, customers are frontline failure reporting mechanisms. The first time you know you've got a problem is when a customer rings you and tells you. That's very common in water again. So these are key processes, and you always must think about the processes before you get too excited about the IT to put the end result in. So, kind of to finish this off, what kind of information do we need back from the field, people like you, frontline staff? Well, a good principle is that if we can work it out some other way, we don't need to bother you about it. So this question also translates into what information can we only know if people in the field or the shops tell us? We would not know it if the people doing the work on the ground actually inform us. What important information worth your time to collect it would we not know if you didn't tell us it? And this turns out to be very fundamental to asset information and indeed underpin asset management decisions. In case any of you are not familiar, this has been around for, I guess, these systems started in about the 1970s. They come out of maintenance, so they're actually maintenance systems, and they're originally called computerized maintenance management systems. For you, this is part of SAP, or an enterprise asset management system or work management system. And they're pretty straightforward. Basically, we human beings do all the hard work of working out what our planned maintenance schedule is. We feed it into this fairly dumb database, and it's got a clock, so a calendar, so it knows to spit out. If we said, I need half an hour inspection task doing every Tuesday it spits out a work order that then goes to the maintenance teams in the field, who then go and organize. There's some more planning about who's going to take the truck and do it today, to go out and do the work. So this is really the principle of a computerized maintenance management system, an enterprise asset management system. We also now use them for problems to raise a work order in the CMMS or SAP to say that we've seen a problem. And remember that somebody can raise a problem where they don't really know what the problem is. All they can see is there's a problem. They don't know what asset or why. They just think there's a problem we should go out and look at. So a work order comes out on that as well for reactive maintenance, and then maintenance go out and do the work. But this is only half the equation. If we stop there, we are using a fairly dumb database to do a bit of scheduling. Not the hard work, which is thinking of the work in the first place. The real benefit to asset management is what comes back from the field. Now, I invite you to think a little bit about the whole life cost model. Do you remember that we had planned maintenance costs, reactive maintenance costs, and risk costs, part of which comes from the likelihood that the asset has failed. So 3 things in our whole life cost model: what does planned maintenance cost, what does reactive maintenance cost, and what's our failure history. These are things we can only know if we get feedback from the field. In addition, remember the risk-based maintenance, which said where we have condition tasks, inspection tasks to tell us what's happening with our assets. That gives us a kind of, not real time, but over time we can see whether our assets are staying steady or whether they're beginning to deteriorate. And the last bit is that, in fact, I'll come back to this, that the only way we know for sure what assets we have is if we get positive feedback from the maintenance staff that they're still there and they're what we think we are. So let's look at this quickly. So imagine you've been given a reactive work order. Something's not right. We don't know, I'm operations or I'm a customer, I just know there's a problem. We don't even know what asset it is until somebody goes out to look at it. We might think it's an asset when it's in fact something quite different. My stupid example is, I'm afraid, of course, some of these stupidity stories really happen, is that the pump stops working. We shouldn't jump to a conclusion it's something wrong with the pump. What if it's the fuse that's gone in the power supply? There'd be no point in then trying to fix the pump, and it's not actually the pump that's the problem. So the first thing we need when somebody's gone out to fix an asset is confirmation of what asset has failed, and we also need to know why. Now, we went through root cause analysis. This is very important for knowing how we should manage our assets in the future, is to understand why they're failing now. So we must have a way of catching why did this asset fail in the judgment of the maintenance person meant to fix it. Here we use usually failure codes so that the maintenance person doesn't have to write an essay at the end of a busy working day, but can essentially say, this was the fuse, there's a code that says it's a fuse. So we now know, well, this fuse is blowing quite often. We also need to know, unfortunately, what was done, because that's the only way that we can know what it costs to fix. We need to keep track of how long did we spend, what did we replace, and then we can translate that into costs. So this bit, the feedback after we've done a problem work order, we get back the feedback on what the reactive work was. That allows us both to understand what we're spending on reactive maintenance and also what the failure history is. 2 absolutely essential things in working out what we want to do in future. Now, with planned work, this is a bit easier because if it's planned half an hour every Tuesday, I don't need you to tell me that it took half an hour. I might need you to warn me if it's not taking half an hour, it's taking an hour and a half, because then something's going wrong. But if it takes half an hour every Tuesday, all I really need is to press a button to say it's done. And that then we can turn into what our planned maintenance is costing. It's also quite important that we do know that planned work has been done. Planned work is essentially a way to manage asset risk. And we need positive confirmation that if we're managing risks through inspections or replacing parts, that the work was actually done, so we know that we're on top of the risk. Remember, I said when we look at risk assessment, we need to know that we're actually carrying out those tasks. This isn't to keep track on you, it's to keep track on the risk. Updating asset condition from inspection results or condition assessments so that we actually know what's happening with our assets over time. And then last but not least, it's amazing in something like a GIS system how very difficult it is to get it right first time. We've got thousands of assets and all over the place, and usually they're not completely accurate. And yet it really matters that we know exactly what we've got. And the only way we can really know if we've got the assets where we think they are and what they are is if maintenance, when they see something, I'm not asking for confirmation that it is where we thought it was, but if we see something where it shouldn't be, or it's not what we thought it was, that we get an update to the asset register. It's the only way to keep what we have in our asset portfolio accurate. This is invaluable. There's no way known to make this accurate from a distance. It's only accurate if the people who know tell us if something's changed. Of course, the maintenance team itself might have replaced something, in which case we need an update. All right, now if that sounds like a bit of work, I hope after this course you can see why it's so useful to know these things. Here, what I would say is that it's most important that we make sure our processes and our IT systems make this as easy as possible to do. To make it easy to give the right data is easier than doing the wrong data or not doing it at all. We have to work in partnership to make sure this flow both ways really works to everybody's advantage. And obviously, if we don't like the results, something's costing too much, it's failing too often, its condition is awful, then we need to start thinking, well, do we need to replace it? Do we need to change its maintenance? So this flow, I can't overemphasize how much this underpins good asset management. Okay, I'm now going to hand you over to your colleague, Julie de Young.